Michael. The billion-dollar biopic that critics hated and audiences couldn't get enough of. Michael Jackson was arguably the most famous entertainer the world has ever produced. So why did it take Hollywood this long and this much money to actually get his story on screen? And why did the version that finally arrived end up looking almost nothing like the one that was originally planned? By the time Lionsgate's biopic Michael reached theaters, it had survived years of legal battles, a scrapped ending, an 11th-hour reshoot that cost tens of millions of dollars, and a critical reception so divided it barely makes sense on paper. Critics tore it apart. Audiences turned it into the highest-grossing music biography in history. Somewhere in that gap between the reviews and the box office receipts is the real story of how this film got made, and why it worked anyway. Stick around, because by the end of this you'll understand exactly why a movie that scored under 40% with critics ended up outperforming Oppenheimer at the global box office. Have you seen it yet? Let us know where you land on it. A child prodigy under a demanding father. The film opens in the late 1960s, tracing the rise of a kid from Gary, Indiana, who would eventually be called the King of Pop. Before he was a solo phenomenon, he was the youngest member of the Jackson 5, performing alongside his brothers under the relentless supervision of his father, Joe Jackson. The young Michael is played in these early scenes by newcomer Juliano Krauswaldez, while Coleman Domingo takes on the role of Joe, portraying him as a man whose ambition for his sons curdled into something closer to control. The Jackson 5's breakthrough with Motown put the family on the map nationally. But the film makes clear that success came at a cost. Joe didn't want Michael's talent to eclipse the group, and that tension, a brilliant son straining against a domineering father, becomes the emotional spine that the rest of the film keeps returning to. What's striking is how much time the film spends on the mechanics of that pressure. Long rehearsals, public performances demanded of a child barely old enough for school, and a household where mistakes weren't tolerated. It's not subtle filmmaking, but it does the job. By the time Michael Jackson becomes a global superstar, the audience already understands what it cost him to get there. Before we go further, there's an image that has been circulating online worth mentioning. It shows Jaafar Jackson, the actor playing his uncle, next to a digitally altered version of himself made to resemble Michael in his later years. Fans have pointed to the resemblance as proof that this casting choice might have been the smartest decision the studio made. We'll get into why that turned out to be true. Off the Wall, Thriller, and the peak of an era. From there, the story jumps into Jackson's solo breakthrough, covering the release of Off the Wall in 1979 and Thriller in 1982. This stretch of the film is where the production clearly spent the bulk of its energy and budget. Concert sequences, studio scenes, and elaborate recreations of Jackson's most iconic music videos are staged with a level of detail meant to recreate the feeling of watching those moments unfold for the first time. Thriller, of course, went on to become the best-selling album of all time, and the film treats that achievement as the moment Jackson stopped being a former child star and became something the music industry hadn't really seen before. Director Antoine Fuqua leans hard into spectacle here. Whatever criticisms would later be aimed at the film's handling of Jackson's personal life, almost nobody disputes that the concert and video recreations are the strongest material in the movie. Quick question for you. If you could watch one Jackson-era music video recreated shot for shot on a modern soundstage, which one would you pick? Part of what makes this stretch of the film work is the sheer amount of preparation that clearly went into it. Choreographers spent months breaking down Jackson's original movement frame by frame so that Jaafar Jackson's performances would line up with the footage most audiences already know by heart. The costume department reportedly built exact replicas of the red leather Thriller jacket and the sequined glove, down to the stitching patterns used in the originals. None of that guarantees a good film on its own, but it does explain why even the harshest reviews tended to carve out an exception for the concert sequences. The Pepsi commercial and A Quiet Descent. One of the film's few genuinely dark detours comes in its depiction of the 1984 Pepsi commercial shoot, where a pyrotechnics malfunction set Jackson's hair on fire and left him with serious scalp burns. The film doesn't shy away from the intensity of that moment, showing the accident and its chaotic aftermath in some detail. What matters more than the injury itself is what the film suggests came after it. The extended recovery, the surgeries, and the medication prescribed to manage the pain are framed as the starting point of a dependency that would follow Jackson for the rest of his life. It's a rare moment where the film allows some shadow to fall across its otherwise glowing portrait, briefly acknowledging that behind the spectacle was a man in genuine physical pain. There's also a small, softer beat tucked into this section, showing Jackson visiting hospitalized children and buying them gifts, a detail meant to remind the audience of the generosity that coexisted with his private struggles. Breaking away from the family act. The film's first chapter closes around the 1984 Victory Tour, a massive family reunion tour that also marked the beginning of Michael's push to step out from under his father's authority and his brother's shadow. The tour was a commercial triumph, but the movie frames it as the last stand of the Jackson 5 dynamic before Michael fully asserted himself as an independent artist. Rather than closing on that note, though, the film jumps ahead briefly to 1987, ending on a glimpse of Jackson preparing to walk on stage during the Bad Tour, at what the filmmakers clearly intended as the height of his public triumph. It's a deliberately uplifting final image, ending the story before the controversies that would come to define the second half of his public life ever enter the frame. That choice, ending things early and on a high note, turns out to be one of the most consequential decisions in the entire production. And it wasn't the plan from the start. The ending that never made it to theaters. Here's where the story behind the movie gets almost as dramatic as the movie itself. Originally, Michael was not supposed to end on a triumphant tour moment at all. The script's third act was built around 1993, depicting the fallout from child sexual abuse allegations made against Jackson, including a sequence showing investigators searching Neverland Ranch while Jackson stared at his own reflection with police lights flashing outside. Jaafar Jackson reportedly filmed those scenes. They existed. And then, according to reporting on the production, estate lawyers identified a contractual clause that made the footage legally unusable. Director Antoine Fuqua was forced to abandon the ending he had built the entire film structure around and rebuild the third act from the ground up, on a compressed timeline with the cast reassembling for weeks of new material. This single decision explains almost everything critics later objected to. Reviewers accused the film of whitewashing Jackson's legacy by ignoring the controversies altogether. What most of them didn't know at the time was that the film originally hadn't ignored them at all. It had built its entire dramatic arc around them, before a legal technicality forced the filmmakers to cut that material and stitch together a different ending under pressure. Does that change how you judge the finished film, knowing the darker version existed and was pulled at the last minute? It's worth sitting with that question before deciding where you land on the whitewashing criticism. Think about what that actually meant for everyone involved. Fuqua wasn't just trimming a scene or softening a line of dialogue. He was losing his entire final act, the section of the film that every earlier scene had presumably been building toward, and had to find a new emotional landing point that could still feel earned. Ending on the Bad Tour instead of the Neverland investigation isn't a neutral swap. It changes the entire meaning of the film, turning a story about a fall from grace into a story about an unstoppable rise. Whether that reframing was a creative failure or simply the only option left once the footage became legally untouchable is something audiences may never get a straight answer to, since neither the studio nor the estate has said much publicly about what exactly was in that cut material. Building the world, production, and reshoots. Principal photography began in early 2024 across Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, where the production team built full-scale replicas of the Jackson family's Gary, Indiana home and the Neverland Ranch estate. Cinematographer Robert Richardson, an Oscar winner for his work on JFK and The Aviator, shot the film using a combination of 35mm film and digital cameras, aiming for a texture that could shift between gritty realism and glossy concert spectacle depending on the scene. More than 500 crew members worked on the production, including a small army of choreographers, costume designers, and makeup artists tasked with recreating some of the most photographed outfits and hairstyles in pop culture history. Fuqua spent months rehearsing with Jaafar Jackson before cameras rolled, reportedly pushing him through dance sequences that ran 14 hours at a stretch. An intentional echo of the grueling rehearsal culture the real Michael Jackson endured throughout his touring career. Then came the part nobody outside the production expected, the reshoots. In June 2025, the cast returned for a 22-day shoot to rebuild the film's ending after the original third act was scrapped. Estimates on the added cost vary, with some reports putting the reshoot expenses between $40 and $50 million on top of the original budget. Because the need for reshoots stemmed from the estate's own legal oversight rather than any error by the studio, the Jackson estate reportedly covered the additional costs. The reshoots also pushed the release date back by a full year, from an original April 2025 target to April 2026. Adding another complication, a wildfire in the Palisades area damaged the home of screenwriter John Logan during this period, further slowing the rewriting process. By the time all the dust settled, Lionsgate's initial $155 million budget had ballooned to something close to $200 million, making Michael one of the most expensive biographical films ever produced. To help offset that cost, Lionsgate sold international distribution rights to Universal, keeping domestic and Canadian distribution for itself. Fuqua later described the production as one of the hardest projects of his career. Given everything you just heard, that's not hard to believe. An unknown nephew in the title role. If there's one decision that saved this film, it's the casting of Jaafar Jackson, Michael's real nephew and the son of Jermaine Jackson, in the lead role. Jaafar had no professional acting experience before this project. Fuqua originally considered him for the physical resemblance to his uncle, but what reportedly sealed the decision was a screen test where Jaafar responded to a question in character without breaking, catching the crew off guard with how naturally he embodied the role. Jaafar has said in interviews that acting was never something he pursued or particularly wanted, which makes the gamble the studio took on him even bigger. He spent months studying his uncle's voice, mannerisms, and choreography to prepare, and whatever the film's other flaws, almost nobody, critics included, has seriously challenged the strength of his performance. Alongside him, Juliano Krauswaldez plays the younger version of Michael in the early Jackson 5 scenes, also making his screen debut. The supporting cast is stacked with recognizable names. Coleman Domingo as Joe Jackson, Nia Long as matriarch Katherine Jackson, Miles Teller as longtime attorney John Branca, Kendrick Sampson as producer Quincy Jones, Kat Graham as Diana Ross, and Jessica Sula as La Toya Jackson. Domingo's portrayal of Joe in particular carries much of the film's dramatic weight, giving the family conflict a genuine sense of menace rather than melodrama. Critics hated it. Audiences didn't care. When Michael finally opened, the reviews were brutal. The film landed around a 38% approval rating among critics, with a similarly unfavorable score on Metacritic. One widely circulated review argued that the film sidestepped the uncomfortable parts of Jackson's biography almost entirely, framing the omission as a fundamental flaw rather than a stylistic choice. Multiple outlets used the word sanitized to describe the finished product, arguing that a film unwilling to engage with the more troubling chapters of its subject's life couldn't be taken seriously as a biography. And yet, audiences responded almost the opposite way. Michael pulled in a 97% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes alongside an A- cinema score, the kind of grade that historically signals strong word of mouth and staying power at the box office. It reportedly became the best audience-reviewed musical biopic the platform had ever recorded. Why the disconnect? For most audiences, the emotional pull of Jaafar Jackson's performance and the sheer scale of the musical sequences outweighed concerns about historical completeness. People didn't come for a rigorous biography. They came to feel something watching Thriller and Billie Jean recreated at full scale, and on that front, the film delivered. Which side of that divide are you on? Do you weigh a biopic more on accuracy or on how it makes you feel while you're watching it? Spike Lee steps in. Amid the criticism, filmmaker Spike Lee, who directed Jackson's music video, They Don't Care About Us, along with 2 documentaries about his life, publicly defended the film. Lee said in an interview that he had watched Michael twice and argued that critics were judging the film unfairly by holding it accountable for events that happened after the story's timeline ends. Since the narrative concludes around 1988, years before the first allegations became public in 1993, Lee's point was that expecting the film to address controversies from outside its own chosen timeframe misunderstood what the movie was actually trying to do. It's a defense that only works if you don't know about the scrapped 1993 ending we mentioned earlier, which makes Lee's comments land a little differently once you have that context. Breaking records from opening weekend onward. Whatever the reviews said, moviegoers showed up in numbers nobody expected. Michael opened to roughly $97.2 million domestically and $217.4 million worldwide, comfortably beating the previous record for a musical biopic opening, held by Straight Outta Compton at around $60 million. IMAX screenings alone brought in over $24 million, the strongest large-format opening any music biopic had ever posted. The film launched simultaneously across 82 international markets, with especially strong turnout in Japan, the United Kingdom, and Brazil. From there, the box office trajectory just kept climbing. On June 14, 2026, Michael crossed $911.9 million globally, edging past Bohemian Rhapsody's long-standing record of $910.9 million to become the highest-grossing music biopic ever made, a record that had stood for nearly 8 years. 2 weeks later, on June 28, it passed Oppenheimer's total of $975.8 million, making it the highest-grossing biographical film of any kind in cinema history. Then, on July 12, 2026, the film crossed the $1 billion mark, becoming the first biopic ever to reach that milestone. Of that total, roughly $371.8 million came from North America and about $629.8 million from international markets, with Japan, where Jackson remains one of the most beloved foreign musical artists of all time, playing an outsized role in pushing the film past the billion-dollar line. For Lionsgate, a studio that had seen its box office fortunes decline sharply over the previous decade, Michael became its first-ever billion-dollar release and its highest-grossing film in the company's history, surpassing even The Hunger Games, Catching Fire. Studio leadership has openly called it a turning point, and given how far Lionsgate's theatrical revenue had fallen in recent years, it's easy to see why. What happens now? So where does that leave Michael, a film critics dismissed as shallow and incomplete, but one that audiences turned into the biggest biographical movie of all time? A sequel is reportedly already in development, with a portion of the follow-up already filmed, suggesting the studio isn't done exploring this story, controversial ending or not. Maybe the real lesson here isn't about Michael Jackson at all. It's about what happens when a film's box office fate ends up being decided by audiences rather than critics, and what gets left out of a story when legal pressure rewrites an ending at the last possible minute. What do you think the sequel should cover if it ever gets made? Drop your take, and if this kind of behind-the-scenes breakdown is something you want more of, stick around, there's more of this coming.